Welcome to the Tax Alpha Solutions Podcast, hosted by Matt Chansey. Matt is a tax consultant, author, and certified financial planner with almost 2 decades helping his clients grow their net worth. On the show, Matt brings together an array of specialists to share with you their experience and success along with strategies of the 1%. Matt Chansey is with Coastal One, member FINRA SIPC. And now, here's your host, Matt Chansey.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Matt Chansey, and today's another episode of the Tax Alpha Podcast. Today, I've got a couple of legal professionals with us from the Cueto Law Group. First, I've got Santiago Cueto, obviously one of the named partners, and then bringing with him today is Davey Carcassonne, who specializes in Swiss law. And I don't want to go too far into it because I know they have some international specializations. So if you're doing cross-border transactions or you're a global company, you're definitely going to want to pay attention to what we're talking about here today. I think you'll find some really interesting nuggets in there. So gentlemen, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having us, Matt.
Absolutely. Now, Santiago, on the pre-call, you talked a little bit about, your law firm, your area of specialization, and the fact that you're board certified. I think everybody's heard that term before, but lean into that a little bit and help us understand what that really means.
Well, sure. It's just a fancy term to say that we're experts in international law. We're only one of a handful of maybe 50, less count, out of 100,000 attorneys across the state that can call themselves experts in international law. What does that mean? Well, we help businesses do business globally, whether it's a dispute across borders or a transaction across borders. We're the experts that can help companies do that.
Very nice. Very nice. And I guess geographically, it really doesn't matter. Are there some countries that are easier to do business with, some that are more complicated?
Oh, that's a great question. On my list is Brazil is very difficult to do business with. The World Bank comes out with an ease of doing business index every year. Brazil is always kind of towards the bottom because there's so much red tape and bureaucracy. Mexico is another one that we have trouble working with. And certainly you can imagine Russia, with the things going on there. But those are kind of the 3 countries I stay away from, apart from the ones that are obviously on the embargo list of the United States. The easiest ones, for instance, Singapore routinely comes out at the top. They're very open for business, as well as the Scandinavian countries.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought with as many Brazilian tourists that come, to the United States or specifically Florida on a regular basis, and Mexico being our next door neighbor right next door, you wouldn't think that they would make it so complicated to do cross borders business.
It really can be difficult, particularly with enforcing cross-border judgments. We always recommend to include in your contracts international arbitration clauses. We have 192 countries that have signed on to it, that if you have a judgment in one country, or an arbitration award rather, you can walk that into the other country. Most of them have signed on to what's called the New York Convention. That's a treaty that says, hey, if you got this arbitration award, then you can walk it into pretty much any country as long as you follow due process. Try that with the U.S. judgment and try enforcing that in China. Try enforcing that in Mexico or Brazil or any other country. They're going to give you a hard time. So, a big tip to your listeners is if you can have an international contract, always include an international arbitration provision versus a litigation provision. A litigation provision, you'll certainly get a judgment, but again, it's going to be incredibly difficult to enforce that around the world. Whereas an arbitration clause will make it much more easier to walk that in. You just meet the minimum requirements, and that's going to be enforceable as if it was a judgment rendered by the courts of that country you're trying to enforce it in. It's a very powerful mechanism.
Davey, you have something to follow up on that?
Sure. Yes. There's also as well the pros of having an arbitrational clause is that the dispute is private. You don't want to have the name of the companies to be public in state courts. Certainly, when you Google the company, you can find out this company is getting sued or this company is suing so. So you don't want to have that reputation. Arbitration is sort of protecting, giving you a layer to have a private procedure instead of having a wide open to the public procedure, which is really useful in certain ways. And they're a lot faster. I mean, they can be more expensive, but they're a lot faster to solve. This is true for, I would say, local arbitration, but international arbitration takes a little longer to the discovery request that we have to ask to the other party. And sometimes the documents, there's so much documents and there's so much laws between countries that are intertwining with each other. So that's why it takes a little longer in that perspective. But at least, like Santiago said, once you have an award, you don't have to go and fight in state court in that specific country. You already have an award in arbitration. So basically what you have to do is hire an attorney in that country and just enforce it. And that's simple. And if that country does not enforce it, go around the country where that specific company has assets, enforce it over there. And it's a win for you. You have a much more wider perspective to reach out to have a remedy through international arbitration than through state court or national courts of the countries.
That's interesting. So I guess based on the treaty, the international treaty that you talked about for the arbitration provision, so if one country I have bad dealings in, but there's another country that's also a party to that agreement, but we know that counterparty or that other business has assets in the other country, you could actually collect them there, even though it originated potentially in another place.
Right. That's exactly what's going on. And also as well, I want to point out something. When you do an investment, a cross-border investment, normally sometimes countries sign on the treaties called bilateral investment treaties. And sometimes those contract agreements don't tend to have an arbitration, but that doesn't mean that the tribunals like ICSID, ICC, or AAA that use the rules of SCDR don't have jurisdiction over the issue at stake. So for example, there was a case I was used to get involved as a law clerk, which right now it's online, so we can talk about it. And I was involved into Jamaica versus Dominican Republic under Mr. Leachin, which was a Portland holding. Well, they were suing Dominican Republic because there was a government misappropriation under the investment. So we actually called the investment treaty, the bilateral investment treaty, to gain jurisdiction over the issue. And Dominican Republic was fighting on jurisdiction, saying there's no jurisdiction. The tribunal does not have jurisdiction to hear the issue. But in the end, they prevailed. I think this law firm prevailed on the jurisdictional issues, and they found out that actually they are actually binded by the treaty. So sometimes the host state can consent by being binded by treaty, to which indirectly create an international arbitrational clause within the contract without having them sometimes. And the tribunals will have jurisdiction to hear about these cases. So you're going to see this most of the time. So for example, like one of the treaties that actually recently was passed was the USMCA, which is the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, which replaced actually the free trade agreements between the US and Canada, the North Atlantic trade agreement most of the time. And it replaced it. Well, that's an FTA. That's a free trade agreement. Under that treaty, the ICC would probably have jurisdiction to hear the case. So if there's let's say a company trading from the US with Canada, then, and it has a breach of contract or an issue in the trades, or it could be a government misappropriation, the tribunals under that specific treaty will have jurisdiction to hear the case. So even though there's no international arbitrational clause, however, it's still preferable that we add an international arbitrational clause to make it clear to the parties, so jurisdiction is not a dispute. That's exactly what we want to do. So you want to take away the argument of jurisdiction, so it's less longer and there's no opportunity for the other party to dispute jurisdiction over the tribunals for recuperate a remedy. So that was the issues on the international arbitrational clause. And I keep telling this to our clients, you need an arbitrational clause to protect your company. So that's basically it.
Interesting. It's kind of like when you used to watch one of those old cop shows back in the day, and the first cops were there and they were trying to investigate the scene, and another group of cops rolls up on it and says, "Hey, this is our crime scene. You get out of here. You know, you don't have jurisdiction here."
That's
right? So it reminds me of that when you obviously on a much more, and I can only imagine how complicated that gets, because not only are the laws different in different regions, right, but the languages are different and the cultures are different. And I'm sure that has to play out in how the legal remedy is ultimately solved because of all those differences, correct?
That's correct. It's also, culturally, in arbitration, it's a lot more formal, a lot more cordial, versus where you see the United States just beating down their throats and being very, very aggressive. That's a no-no when you sit in front of an arbitration tribunal in Switzerland, for instance. They expect, a firm argument, but very respectful. So that's a cultural nuance that I myself have got to, remember to keep in mind after a couple decades of doing this. When you're arguing a different culture, you really have to do as Romans do. And that's one particular nuance that us U.S. trained attorneys need to remember to kind of hold back and remember that manners matter. And so it's very important to maintain a cordial, collegial approach to approaching the arbitration tribunal in other jurisdictions. That'll take you a lot further away than being aggressive.
Understood. Don't argue too aggressively during somebody else's siesta time.
That's right.
Right. That's correct.
Particularly in Spain.
Right. Absolutely in Spain. But at the same time, when you go to arbitration, you don't get to have the objection rules of evidence that we have here in the United States. Like you have hearsay objections, you have relevancy objections. You see them even in movies. Sometimes in movies it says objection, Your Honor, and you yell that out. And then here it goes, the soap opera and the entire drama that's going around the action that happened here. No, in arbitration, there's no objection. Most of the time there's no objection unless it's stated under the contract. They're using the federal rules of civil procedure and evidence under the arbitration. But otherwise, the only thing you can do is just sit down and listen to cross-examination and direct examination.
Got it. And David, you brought up something when you first talked that I thought was interesting, the privacy issue of this. I can imagine that there are many businesses and companies that get into lawsuits that are cross-border that at the end of the day, if your name is smeared in a bunch of lawsuits and it ultimately becomes public, there's an element of reputational risk of, even if you're not a bad actor, people saying, hey, I don't know that I want to do business with these people. Look at all the lawsuits that they're in, right? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, the alternate dispute resolution ADRs tend to be more private in those sectors. And what's really beneficial for companies to go to ADR is that they're not exposed to state courts in public hearing, because, in Florida, and certainly under the Constitution, everybody has a right to a public hearing, including companies. And therefore, actually, that exposed them to certain bad naming, and also the reputation get hurt indirectly for doing businesses. And I want to give you one great example. Actually, I used to work with my father before becoming an attorney, and we were actually importing goods from China, and actually furnishing cruise lines, Norwegian Cruise Lines, Carnival Cruise Lines at the time. And of course, we had disputes. Of course, we had problems. But the problem is that it brought it into state court. And now when we wanted to go to retail stores industry, they were Googling our company and they found out, we had a lawsuit against Norwegian Cruise Line. And now they starting questioning about what happened. Why is such a hospitality company having a lawsuit with a provider here? And it's not the only lawsuit we had. We had also a lawsuit with Carnival, and we had a lawsuit with other things. So what's happening is that now the company is having a reputation that it's getting into trouble all the time. So that's why with an arbitration, they wouldn't have that access to see those cases. They may have limited access to see them, but it's not going to pop up on Google, for example. So it's going to be really hard to find them. You have to really fish for them to find those cases under an arbitrational clause and under an arbitrational proceedings. So that's why I say it's really, really important for companies to understand that arbitration, it is an alternative dispute resolution. And sometimes it's more beneficial for the companies to go to arbitration in order to protect their names. Certainly when you look at Tesla, for example, Tesla used to have a lot of lawsuits against their employees for worker composition. And now Tesla implemented an arbitrational clause because it doesn't want to have that reputation anymore. They want to hide them, and they don't want to give access to state court. It's correct, because what happened next is that the company is actually losing a lot of money through the attorney's fees and cost, through a state court, which is a lot slower in the process of cases, and arbitration is a lot faster. And then they can actually keep their reputation among themselves during the proceedings, so they can centralize the proceedings. It's not necessarily, again, to try to stop the people from, to file a lawsuit against Tesla, but it's true that it can be a problem sometimes, such as if you file an individual has to file an arbitration against a company, it can be prejudicial in those sorts because it's expensive. You have to pay for the arbitrators, you have to pay for the lawyers, You have to pay for everything else. But between companies transacting among each other, that should be no-brainer. That's where I'm coming from.
Understood. Look, I don't think anyone has ever uttered the words before that an attorney cost me too much extra money and wasted too much of my time. That's never happened before, has it?
Of
No
course
big
not.
no big deal. Hey, so Santiago, like you've been doing this for 2 decades. You're board certified. You've seen probably, I don't want to say everything there is to see at this point, because we can always learn
Yeah.
something new every day. But just super curious, out of all the fields of study that you could have picked or all the disciplines in law, how did international law become your focus?
Well, that's an interesting background. I'm the son of a CIA foreign intelligence officer. I grew up in right near Langley, near headquarters. And of course, I found out my dad worked there when we had to drop him off there. There's a big sign on the GW Parkway that says CIA headquarters, next right. There's no hiding it anymore. I knew my dad was worked for the CIA. My mom was over at Georgetown, and she also, while she was working at Georgetown, which is just down the river from there, if you know DC, she was also in the CIA for a limited project. And I found that out about 5 years ago. So there was a time for both my parents to work with the CIA. So I grew up in this international, kind of intelligence field. My dad always, we'd watch James Bond movies and whatnot. And I just thought that was always really interesting to travel and to learn different cultures. It's not as glamorous as they show on TV, but that certainly from a very early age exposed me to the international world. And that's what piqued my interest. And I went to school, I got a master's in foreign affairs, and I wanted to take it a step further and apply that and to go in international law, which I didn't really know was an area that existed. The business side of things, I didn't want to necessarily get into the government, what's called public international law, but I do what's called, private international law, enforcing contracts, putting deals together around the world. So it was kind of an offshoot of that interesting background that I had with my dad being the CIA.
That is super interesting. Yeah, I can't say that I've ever met anyone before with a master's in foreign affairs. I mean, leaning into it in that way almost predisposes you to say, hey, I've already been in touch with this world. I understand it a little bit.
Right.
This is just the next logical step. So
That's right.
That makes a lot of sense. And so has it been everything that you've wanted it to be, the expansion of the foundational years?
Well, it has. It certainly allowed me a great deal of travel. We've had some really interesting cases around the world. We had this really interesting case, an arbitration case against the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, where I had to serve the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, our law firm, and for the misappropriation of one of our clients' assets that they had a bank in Kyrgyzstan. That was under a bilateral treaty. It was at The Hague in the Netherlands. It was really, really interesting. And it's a very intellectual exercise. Everything's done on paper. And, the exchange of papers and different arguments. And ultimately, we did prevail against the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. And I thought that was a really interesting case. Something my father probably did more clandestine, but I was able to do and bring justice to my client in a more public way.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Davey,
if you don't mind, how did you end up in this field? Of all the things you could have done, how did you end up doing this?
My great-grandfather, Jack Mitrani at the time, was barred in Istanbul, Turkey. He was barred also in Switzerland, and he was barred in Israel. So technically, he was at the time, actually, Israel was declaring their independence. And that's who he represented with Golda Meir to the UN. He actually gave the independence to Israel, and it was actually the advisory council, one of them at least. And he actually got the independence of Israel to actually be independent and represent them at the UN. So what happened next is that I started getting to an interesting field of international law. Certainly my international background, because I'm from Switzerland. I have also a lot of families around the world, from Israel to Turkey to England. They're all spread out throughout the world. And then at the same time, I speak different languages. So that just kind of brought me to that perspective that maybe I should use my international background in the legal field in a certain ways that could be more beneficial to all clients. So no, I have also been like Santiago said that his father was in the CIA. Back when I was in high school, actually, I was actually recruited to be one of the trainees of the CIA, the first non-American who was a European only to attend the training at the CIA at the Trinity College in Washington, D.C. under the Bush administration. And I think it was only 20 students out of 2,000 or 4,000 applicants were allowed with a full scholarship. to go to DC and start doing their seminar training over the summer. And unfortunately, how you're going to look at it, I couldn't follow through with this because my green card was denied when I was in college. So I couldn't continue to go through the CIA training and stuff like that, and continue to do all these seminars and also be possibly recruited right after college. That was the ultimate goal. So at the end of the day, that's when my father says, go to law school and become an attorney. And then I said, I'll become an international lawyer. That's even better. So that's where I came from.
It was in the family a little bit. You were kind of following the footsteps. It was in the family. Well, both of you guys had it in the family. I mean, that was the international cross borders thing. That was just what was normal to you growing up. It was kind of a standard deal, you know? So I think that's rare. I don't think everybody has kind of a at home when they're born and raised. For me, like my parents certainly weren't. They didn't cross the state of Florida borders, much less international borders. So it was a very, very different exposure that I had. So I understand.
Yeah. No, right. And now since everything now, as you see with the issues in Ukraine, is affecting everybody. So every global issues that's been happening, even the pandemic, is actually affecting everyone locally as well. So we're so interconnected with other countries and other nationalities that it just, like now all the affairs of foreign affairs are globalized, and there's no way to escape it anymore. Every product that's coming from the United States is coming from China. Or sometimes they come from Uzbekistan or outside the country because we try to manufacture them due to their pricing. Or maybe sometimes there are, like investment or investors that want to diversify your investment and want to go outside the US and try to invest in real estate close to the border of Ukraine and help Ukrainian refugees to house them over there. So you have like a really international community. And I think I cannot think more of a state than Florida, who's even more an international state than any other state so far, beside New York. So that's actually Florida is a growing state. It's catching on to New York now, because now since the pandemic has affected New York tremendously, all the people from New York are coming down South Florida. So you have more global companies that are even moving down South Florida, making even more Florida the chair of arbitration, international disputes, or one of the heads out there.
Understood and agreed. For the longest time, I'm from Florida, born in Florida, Florida native, as far as you can go back. For the longest time, a lot of people thought I was a dumb Southerner. Turns out now I just happen to be early. I was way ahead of the curve. That's all.
That's right.
But I think you bring up a really good point. I think in the past couple of years with COVID and the international response to a global pandemic, and now like the invasion in Ukraine and how that's messed up energy supply chains, I don't think we're always as conscious about the goods and services that we purchase, how they're internationally connected, and that it takes an international business cross borders network to do that. But I think that's become super obvious to a lot more people, how, maybe it's almost analogous to the butterfly effect a little bit. Can you speak to that, Santiago?
Well, a lot of people didn't know what supply chain was before the pandemic. All of a sudden, when you need toilet paper, you quickly learn the word supply chain, right? And these kinds of essentials. And we had no idea why, of all things, is it toilet paper that people are rushing to. It was, now I understand the supply chain, where paper comes from. We all kind of ignore the fact that we show up to the grocery store and things are just there magically. You have little elves at night that just, pack everything and restock it at night. But everything comes a long way. They have no idea that there's every link in that global supply chain is vital important. If that one link is broken, then the whole thing collapses, as we've seen with the chip manufacturers, with car dealerships and the car industry, electronics. So it goes from toilet papers all the way up to something sophisticated as chips. Everything is become involved and tied to the supply chain. We all remember when that ship got caught in the Suez Canal and exacerbated things, because now it blocked things by a week. We know the port in Long Beach was backed up with ships sitting out there for a long time, sitting with all our supplies that we need for everyday living. It's only during the pandemic that we all began to realize that a lot of the stuff, most of the stuff, comes from somewhere else, some other country, which other laws govern and things. So I think the pandemic has really put things in the forefront in terms of how global things really are. Whether you live in Boise, Idaho, here we are. It's going to affect you.
Sure, sure. So here's a question, and you guys are on the front lines of this. There's been, it feels like from my perspective, and I'm clearly an outsider, that there's been a push to, if we can bring it back to US soil, we bring it back and we do it domestically so that we have a little bit more. The cost may be higher, but paying a higher cost and having control of your supply chain it's a balancing act, right? So what's that? And I'm sure that that type of decision doesn't happen overnight. So what are you seeing on that front? What's happening? And is it really moving that way?
Well, we're seeing a lot of, at least down here locally, Miami in particular, warehousing, commercial real estate has boomed. We're out here near the Everglades. Those outer ends, fringes of the Everglades are now being developed to house warehouses. Amazon went from, during the pandemic, from maybe 2 or 3 warehouses to, I don't know how many now, just locally. So a lot of companies are thinking ahead of time and now providing a lot of inventory to create a buffer between the next time something like this happens. We'll have some inventory, where before we did it, build it, as fast as you can, only when the need arised. I know, for instance, Dell, for instance, you would only manufacture when the order was placed, but you can't operate like that anymore. You need to stock up, have warehouses in place to create that buffer now, in case there is a kink in the supply chain. You're able to service your clients at least for a couple of weeks or maybe some months. That's going to give you enough of a heads up to kind of bring, restore the supply chain, restore things would look at the end as if it never happened. So I'm seeing a lot of warehousing, and the prices of land in terms of industrial areas have really shot up as a result. So I am seeing it locally.
Sure. Davey, did you have an opinion on that?
Well, here's the thing about the United States in terms of their global markets. If the U.S. is independent, most of the economy around the world is going to completely be destroyed. The United States is one of the biggest consumers out of all countries in the world. The U.S. is one of the biggest country in terms of consumers. And if the U.S. is actually starting to be more independent, then actually there's no trades around there, and it started to be actually internalize everything else. So we have also that problem as well, because if the U.S. is independent, then how the country is actually going to be in shambles. But then now some people may say, but that's not our problem, that's their problem. But it can become our problem because we cannot supply everything in the country. Some crops, agricultural crops, to cottons, to technology, certain things that we do not have does exist in other countries that we need to bring it on to the United States in order for us to develop over time. But if you start doing too much containing the U.S. at a certain point where we're so independent and we don't need anybody else, then first, of course, the prices will rise, but also as well, you're going to create an issue of other countries of being not in economical well-being per se. And also as well, it's what we have also with the retailers, certainly with retail stores, is that they don't want to increase the price per pieces. So basically what's happening is that when you create something here in the United States, the goods is only expensive because the labor is more expensive. But when you have China who's devaluing their currency, and the yen's currency is actually completely devalued and do it on purpose so they can actually export even more and be combative in terms of trading. So now it's pushing all the retail stores to order from China for, instead of buying for 100,000 pieces, like at $500,000 that would be here in the United States, they'll pay for like $250,000 in China and pay the expenses on the cost for trading. Now we have the problem with shipping cost, which actually comes into the terms, but sometimes what we used to do when I used to work with my father's company is that we had an agreement with the manufacturers in China that tend to cover it sometimes, those shipping costs. So if we order as much, they cover the cost of shipping and it comes over here FOB. So that's where my international trade expertise tend to actually come in place, because I understand also the Incoterms of international trades under the UCC Article 2 when we have litigation international trade law. So this is really an aspect that the United States need to take into account. Certainly not the US dollars almost became as much more valuable than the euros recently on the Forex exchange. And this actually shift in markets can be problematic because now Europeans, they're not going to come here. It's more expensive for the tourists to come here to bring the economy up in the United States and buy goods from the United States. So they might as well stay in Europe and buy them from there. It's a lot cheaper over there. So now you have that issues with also being investors. The investors, actually, I want to talk about one more thing about regarding Ukraine. The Russian oligarchs, morally, the fact that the United States took over the property of Russian oligarchs, morally, I would be okay with it. But in the legal aspects, to do this with that due process of laws, kind of like lose the confidence of also outside investors that are not Russian to actually invest in the United States and say, whoa, the United States can do a government misappropriation without due process of laws. So that's another problem that we're facing here in the United States now. Now we actually losing confidence of other foreign investors to come around the United States. Not as much, but we sort of are showing that the United States government can misappropriate goods without having an opportunity for a hearing before we do so. So, and this is really tremendously important for the United States to keep the balance of trying to get the confidence of the foreign investors to come around here and invest. And by doing what we're acting like European countries have done, we're losing those confidence of foreign investors. That's all I had to add.
Understood. You know, look, I don't think any political system is perfect, right? They're all flawed in all the ways we do business and our governments and everything. And we often hear it referred to in regards to the United States. It's how we do business is maybe we're the least dirty shirt in the laundry, right? So it's not a perfect world. I don't think any of us are living in a perfect world. We're making the best out of a bad situation most times is what we're doing. You know, and it's funny, I read an article the other day on a Russian oligarch that had his yacht seized, like a $50 million yacht or something, and they were going to auction it off. And I'm thinking, what person would be brave enough to buy a Russian oligarch's? There's only so many places you can park that thing. And the odds are that guy's still going to be in those circles. And that guy shows up with his entourage one day, he's like, hey, that's my boat.
That's right. That's true. I didn't think about that, but yeah.
I'm like, I want no part of that conversation. That's not going to go down well.
Yeah, I'll move on to another boat. You can have it.
Yeah, you can have that boat. Yeah. Oh, you want your boat back? You can have your boat back. Yeah. No.
That's a very good practical point I did not consider.
Yeah, right. So just because you could doesn't mean you should sometimes. You have to think
right.
a little bit, right? Interesting points on that. So you brought up, and another point that I thought about real quick when you mentioned that is, you know, you talk about the relationship that countries have and the way that they do business and interact. And if they're too independent, that it makes them not play well with others, right? And it doesn't work well and it's not good for the global economy. Well, that's really not much different than a human relationship, right? If a man or a woman or a friend is so independent, like people get tired of hanging out with them or nobody wants to date them, right? Because they just don't ever want to do it anybody else's way. So it would make sense that it's, you know, a country is just a collective of humans. Not much different that way, right?
Yeah.
Well, it also helps also in the political aspect. Sometimes we have allies like Canada, and we have products that are coming in outside of Canada as well into the US. So if we start out saying to Canada, I don't want to trade with you anymore, let's see how we're going to take that. So that's also another way to keep relationship close to the good countries, our allies around you. Certainly in dire times where Russia is invading Ukraine, you need allies now. So it's not, we don't need to make enemies anymore.
Sure. So I would assume, but I want to ask, as politics change in our country, and I can't say that I necessarily follow politics abroad internationally, I really don't, unless it's big headlines and there's big optics around it. But as our domestic politics changes, I would have to assume that has a major impact on what you do on a day-to-day in your business in allowing how cross-border transactions in business can be affected. Santiago, can you speak to that?
Well, you know, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is, for instance, climate change. We've got a big push here locally, politically, on climate change, and we want to spread that all over the world. We want to make it more expensive. For instance, if you're importing cars, it's got to meet this requirement to the EPA. For instance, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, importing them, they've got to be street legal in the United States. They've got to be retrofitted. So the cost, the local politics, whatever we have going on here, it does affect what goes on globally. It makes things more expensive when you're talking about things like climate change. So that's when local government or domestic government can impact how things are done globally. And sometimes they don't think like that. They just think, well, we want our country to have clean air, without really thinking at least the short-term economic losses that may accrue as a result of making things more expensive, more difficult to deal with in terms of compliance issues.
Sure, understood. I mean, look, we all want a better environment,
Sure.
but that's a long-term good, and most people have a short-term thinking. So, somebody having air conditioning when it's hot, or heat when it's cold, or power lights when it's dark, and the ability to heat their food takes much more importance over the long-term ability of us to be, green or whatever it potentially is.
I think just this week, I think California mandated all electric cars by 2035.
Yes.
Well, you may think 2035, well, that's around the corner. I'm old enough to know that time goes by pretty fast.
Yep.
And you can't possibly retrofit all these cars and make everything globally. This is for all global manufacturers. If you're going to be selling in California or have a car in California, you've got to comply with this. There's, as you've read, a lot of pushback because it's a worthy goal, but I think it's just too short term, even though we're talking about 50 years from now.
Yeah.
Those things take a lot longer.
I agree with that. And, California in and of itself is like the 5th largest economy in the world, right?
That's true.
So, I mean, that is a huge decision for them to ultimately make. And did anybody, that line in the sand sounds great from an optics standpoint.
Sure.
But the ability to execute on that, has anybody thought that through? Can we really get there, right?
Right. It's aspirational more than anything.
I would agree. Davey?
Just fun facts about California is that I think one of their court of appeals actually ruled that bees are fish too, to protect them. So now if you see a bumblebee in California, it's considered a fish under the legal procedures and legal definition. So that happened recently. That happened recently. So it's and the idea is that they're trying to be conservative to the bumblebees to save them from not being killed or some sort of like that. I didn't read the entire cases, but right now bees are fish. So we have flying fish in California going on. So that's why I said with the joke with everybody. In terms of green energy, I had a discussion with a company that provides green energy and tried to actually develop a way to be sort of like renovate the energy, just coming back. What we do is that we take the waste, it's called waste management, waste to energy. So in that way, we're not going to use fossil fuel to accumulate energy. It could be using by wind energy, or it could be also electrical energy in certain ways to create electricity through currents of the water. And I asked them the question, and a simple question, how far are we from being independent from fossil fuel? And he said to me, we are decades away from being independent from fossil fuel. We're definitely not independent from fossil fuel. And as far as an energy that can be reused and overused to produce, it would be an atomic nuclear energy. And a lot of people says, yes, but that pollutes the entire environment. But that's the only type of energy that can be reused over and over is nuclear energy. That's really a question that are we going too fast before we even are independent from fossil fuel? That's another problem that we're facing with the political environment, is that some political parties are pushing for green energy, but we're not there yet. We need to be totally independent, and we need to find the technology to bring us there. And then we can be independent from fossil fuel. But to be early on independent from fossil fuel, it's not going to happen. Not now. And it will take time. It will take a lot of research. It will take a lot of investment. That's why we have a lot of investors that are going inside the United States to try to invest in the US in alternative energy. And also we have investors that go in other countries that try to actually figure out a way to develop something that could be replacing fossil fuels sometimes. So, and I think we're only at the beginning, because it just recently started to have that type of ideas. So yeah, not right now. I think one day it will happen, but it will take a long time until we get there.
Yes, I agree. And look, I happen to know a little bit about this. I attend some really big energy conferences a couple of times throughout the years that, talk about in America, we are detached, right? We are shooting for this green target and it's become a political talking point and all this other stuff. But globally around the world, there are countries, China, India have much larger populations than ours. They have massive amounts of population that have zero access to power. They don't care if it's green. They just want lights. They don't care if it's green. They just want heat, so they're going to burn coal and stuff. And we can't control what they do over there. And who are you to tell somebody in a country that doesn't currently have access to power, that you can't take that dirty power and use that dirty power? Because we did that at one point. That was just 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
That's right.
That's right. It's not our place to be the arbiter of that and make that decision. And like you said, it's just an ambitious goal. I think it's a worthy goal, and we should all strive towards that whole, I'm a little bit older than you, I think, Davey, but I watched Star Trek growing up, and, it was a common goal. We had solved all the problems on Earth, and we were going out and reaching out to other planets at that time. And we're just not all on the same page yet. That may take a little while for us.
That's right.
I love Star Trek, by the
way. So let me ask a question. I think this is on everybody's mind a little bit, these cross-border transactions and the currencies. You talked about China devaluing their currency and the dollar potentially being stronger now than it has been, and it being an import-export issue. How is cryptocurrency or alternative, that whole blockchain, how is that factoring into the international business landscape today?
So what happened is that the crypto started with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was created on the dark web for anonymous transactions, and a way to make transactions a lot easier than having an intermediary party such as the bank in the middle and pay high fees for the transactions to transact from one country to the other country. And the idea of Bitcoin is to remain anonymous. And a lot of criminals back in the dark web was using this as a tool to actually buy drugs or illegal narcotics, or it could be also weapons or anything that they want to do, even illegal services on the dark web. But there's one thing what crypto does really do well that unfortunately international transactions don't really do well. It's the speedy transactions. The fees for transacting a Bitcoin is a lot lesser and a lot faster than actually transferring from one bank to the other bank. It would take you a couple hours to transfer, let's say, 2,000 Bitcoins, then actually having those 2,000 Bitcoins valued would be like probably around $500,000 to $600,000, and you have to transfer this from bank to bank. That will take a couple of days. So that's the one pros about cryptocurrency. Now, the cons of cryptocurrency is that it can get hacked. The blockchain can get hacked, and sometimes, from my perspective, is that the address, when you transact with the address, we have a hash called the MD5 hashes. Those hashes, they actually are the address that we're sending the wallet to wallet. It can just one mistake, and that's it. You lose your 2,000 Bitcoins on that address if you just paste it wrong, or because something could go wrong. You don't have a way to safeguard your money and remedy to the mistake. So sometimes that happens too. And also as well, the only thing with crypto is its volatility. So I don't know if you heard recently about the SEC decision to make Bitcoin as a commodity and the rest of the cryptocurrency as a security. So now they're trying to differentiate Bitcoin, saying it's like gold and silver. Bitcoin is like gold and silver. Meanwhile, it's not something you touch. It's not something physical. It's something that's within the blockchain in its own. But as well, like the other cryptocurrency are becoming like more security, meaning that now they're part of the regulation of the SEC. So now they have to file the different documents and make sure they do their payments to the SEC and make sure they're regulated under the SEC. That's what we're striving for. And a lot of people are opposing this because the idea of cryptocurrency was to freely transact everywhere, anywhere you want. And that was the main idea. And how you make people interested on that transaction is that you increase the value of crypto based on how many people buy. It's just like stocks. and you're just increasing it so much that it becomes volatile. So for example, if you're buying 200 crypto out of 500, then the price will spike up tremendously. And then if that person sells the majority of cryptos out in the world, then you have like the Bitcoin one drop down to $10,000. So that's also another problem with crypto. It doesn't have a stability to stay within the price line. It will just stay, like it can go up really fast and it can go back down and crash to a single dollar. And one of them actually that I saw that this to happen, it was Terra Luna. That was a cryptocurrency that was developing in Korea, and it went up to $200 per coin. But the very next day, when all the investors decided to go away from this program, it went down to 0.000000007. So imagine if you bought Terra Luna when it was back in value between $60 a coin or $200 a coin, then all of a sudden you lost everything. And there's also another problem with crypto. It's rug pull. A lot of scams in crypto, and certainly with the YouTubers and streamers, what they're doing is that they're hyping a cryptocurrency they create. One of them being CX coin. And then what happens next, if they go to their fans, their millions of fans that are watching them, and they say, I'm actually creating a coin, and everybody believes in that coin, and everybody put thousands and thousands of dollars. Before they do, those influencers, YouTubers, they tend to actually invest, let's say, $30,000 of that coin before they do. And then they actually advertise the coin, and then the coin value goes up, and they make $400,000 to $500,000 on that coin, and they start doing a rug pull, meaning that they just sell it all, take their money, and everybody lose their money on the investment that they made on CX coin based on the hype train or the belief that CX coin would be successful. And that's the problem with cryptocurrency. There's a lack of regulation. And the issue is that when it's not falling under the SEC, normally such things under the SEC will be actually illegal to do. So the fact that this has been going on, there's no way to make this person like liable for any damages because cryptocurrency doesn't have regulations at the moment. So you have that problem too. So when you have the crypto coming up, the question you have to say is this crypto a legitimized Bitcoin, like coin that will develop over time? And you have to research, what are we doing? What's the project? You have to look at the ICO, that we call ICO, the initial coin offering. I call it a paper or white paper. Most of the time they think that's actually a legal document, but it's not. ICO for me is just it's just like they're trying to imitate the IPOs, the initial public offering, which is for stocks, and it's not legitimized in some ways. Now, I'm not saying crypto is bad in any ways. It's another interesting way to transact in a faster way. My idea of crypto is this: once you get it in your wallet, take it out immediately. Don't leave it there. Take out the money, transfer in dollars, and you're done. Because once the Bitcoin goes up or it goes down, whatever you had in that wallet can go turn back to zero. Sure. So that's the worriness of crypto.
Sure. Well, I've read, so recently I read an article about a couple of young 30-something-year-old guys that caused a custodial arrangement to basically, or hedge fund to basically collapse they said it could have caused $1 trillion of contagion in the crypto or the currency market. So for me, it's analogous to the internet in 1999, right? There was all these tech stocks, .com, everything. Pets.com wasn't a tech company, but it was back then, right?
I remember. Yeah.
You remember that, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if Davey does, but
it was a sock puppet. It was a mascot. Yeah.
That's right. So the funny thing is everybody's like, the internet's going to change the world. And the internet has changed the world in the way information shared, but it didn't change it in 1999. It took quite a few years beyond that for it to have real utility and for us to really use it for business purposes. And I believe that crypto and blockchain are probably headed down that same path, but we're in the first half of the first inning on this game. And yes, there's a risk return profile, but the risk is not your coin going down in value. The risk is that your custodian steals it or your counterparty is not real. So you could make a fortune and it just be stolen from you overnight and there's no regulation. So what are you going to do?
Well, I want to say one more thing is about crypto because it's something that everybody have to know. That the way utility could work best in crypto right now at the moment, it's when actually, for example, you want to buy for a VPS server, which I don't know if you know what a VPS server is.
What's a VPS server?
It's a server. It's a server that you host somewhere else, and you can use Windows and you can connect through RDP from your computer to that server, and it can host your website. It can host a program. It can host everything else, but it's hosted somewhere else. It's not hosted in your home country. It could be hosted by a company. For example, I think DigitalOcean has VPS servers for cheap. You can buy them and pay per month, and you can use them. A lot of hackers actually are using them for the purpose of hacking. And then what they do is that they put in malicious programs on the VPS server without the hosting company to know about. And then all of a sudden they do the hacking real quick. And if they are hacking like banks, they go against institutions most of the time, and then they go away. So that's how crypto can be used, because if you use crypto, then the hosting company has no record of who actually is renting the VPS server. So that's actually the criminal aspect of hosting, of using crypto most of the time, and remain anonymous. Now, there's also the privacy aspects as well that could be really beneficial in case, for example, if Amazon start using Bitcoin and it gets hacked, then at least your bank account is safe. That's also the privacy aspect that has on its own a really good aspect. But where I'm seeing crypto to evolve really fast, it's not necessarily in the United States. I think crypto will take a lot more time in the United States than Europe to develop over time, because Europe has a privacy laws under the GDPR that it's extremely well set up, and you have a right to your own information. So, for example, if you sign up with Facebook, right, when you put your first and last name on Facebook, you don't have that right of your information. Facebook owns that information from you. So if you want to be Facebook to forget you, you can't, because now Facebook collected that information. They own that information. You can now go away from it. In Europe, it's the reverse. Once you have Facebook and you want to get out of the information, you want Facebook to delete that information, not sell it to anybody, you have a right to do so. And in fact, it was a huge lawsuit of millions and millions of dollars against Facebooks in Europe, and they lost, because there's a right of owning your own information. That's the privacy rights that we do not have in the United States, unfortunately. So at this point, I think crypto protects privacy. It does protect privacy. In the United States, privacy is almost liberal, I would say, and everybody can own your information. So that's where I can see how crypto can develop a little faster in Europe than in the United States in some ways. So that's why we see a lot more hedge funds in Europe, a lot more of fintech companies developing cryptocurrency and being a broker exchange sort of crypto, like Coinbase and Crunchyroll and OK Coins, that are developed in Europe a lot faster than in the United States here in some ways. But in terms of cross-border disputes, now if I bring in on cross-border disputes with cryptocurrency, I haven't seen personally a case yet. I don't know if you have, Santiago, if you saw a case of cryptocurrency on cross-border disputes in international arbitration. I haven't seen one.
No, not yet.
Not yet. And I think it's going to come soon. It's going to come soon. At some point in time, it's going to be there.
Yeah.
We're going to see one.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Look, I think the new wars and the new theft is becoming, it's digital, it's cybersecurity, right? And anything can be used for good or for evil. And unfortunately, you've got a bunch of bad actors that are in. There's some good people, but you've got bad actors in this stuff early, trying to take advantage of the mispricings of the marketplace, or the opaqueness, the lack of understanding of what's going on out there. The more sophisticated taking advantage of the naive in an unregulated space, right? And we've seen that before in many other markets as they've developed, over the years. And this is the forefront. This is where it's at now, is kind of the way I view it. So it's kind of a, I have investors and people ask me all the time, should we be investing in crypto? I'm like, not if you can't, only money you can afford to lose, right?
Right. Entertainment value. Right.
Only money you can afford to lose. So with everything that's going on in the world today, and we've been at this about an hour, and I try to keep these to about an hour just for everybody's bandwidth. But are there any headwinds coming at us like today, like from an international business standpoint, with the political climate, with supply chains, or anything that you're seeing that is going to be a real issue, or create a lot of work or a lot of opportunity? Because I always see, look, opportunity is created out of difficult times, right? There's always something that finds opportunity. So we are going through some difficult times in some ways. What are those times? Do you see some coming, and is it going to create an opportunity?
Well, I think the sophistication of the fraud has become very sophisticated in terms of how people attack. We were just talking about bank accounts and in private information, and exploit that and use it, whether it's ransomware. We've seen ransomware hold up factories, and these are people, malfeasors located in different countries, far away. As long as you get access over the main server, whatever factory running here in the United States, if you're not careful, they're going to hold that factory ransom. They've done it to school districts, having to pay millions and millions of dollars. So the sophistication of fraud is really the number one threat I see to the U.S. economy, in terms of everybody on the ground. All the small to medium to big businesses here really need to have their cybersecurity initiatives in place and backup plans, so to make sure that doesn't happen. If it does happen, have a contingency plan in place.
Sure. And unfortunately, I've had a ton of cybersecurity training. One of the real Achilles heel of it is it's humans, right? So if you have a big organization and you have a ton of people, and the wrong person clicks on the wrong link in a phishing scam or something, then the whole system is potentially compromised.
That's what they're counting on. So it takes education and training of everybody within the organization, and having backup systems to detect those kinds of things.
It's a crazy new frontier. The fight today, it's not a bare knuckle fist fight out in the back behind the lunch room. You know what I'm saying anymore? It's, I know how to hack into your computer and steal all your stuff, and you're not even going to know what's happened, or steal your identity. Right.
I fell prey to a very innocent one, where somebody, what they do is imitate your email addresses. So I had a client, let's say a fake name, Robert Smith. They at gmail.com, they put an extra I in the Smith. Who's going to notice that when you've been emailing back and forth? So they tell me, oh, why are the funds here? And I don't know how they got triggered, but sure enough, was thankfully a small amount of money we got back. But they were able to just replicate and jump into my email and pretend to be somebody else with just a minor change of one letter.
Yep.
So people have to be really careful of that. It's very easy to fall into, no matter how sophisticated you think you are. Again, I'm the son of a CIA guy, say an intelligence officer who fell for that. I feel really dumb.
It happens, and we're so busy. It's not like you get 3 emails in the course of a day. I imagine you get hundreds of emails in the course of a day. So it's a balancing act between being able to get it all. Yeah, I had a client lose a substantial hundreds of thousands of dollars in a wire before, and now they're crazy about when a wire has to go out. How many times that information gets double or triple checked before somebody.
That's true. I do the same.
Totally understand. So, hey, I really appreciate you guys being here today. Santiago, any closing thoughts, anything, any listeners to this podcast that we didn't cover that they should know?
Well, I think the point about, a lot of people in doing international transactions really miss the point about arbitration. I can't stress that enough, that instead of having had a litigation clause in international contracts, you include an international arbitration clause. It provides confidentiality, expediency, and is cost effective. If there's any tip I think to get away from here, is when doing international business, be sure to include an international arbitration clause.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that I just kind of in my head. I would think to hire somebody to do international law if I had a problem with the way I was doing current business. What if I had a product or a service and I go, why aren't I doing business with customers internationally? Could engaging with an international law firm help me develop business strategy to expand cross borders?
Absolutely. We could develop their distribution channels, help them with distribution agreements, trademarking the intellectual property across jurisdictions. Just because you have the United States doesn't give you intellectual property protection in all the other countries of the world. That's a major point. So absolutely, we can help them across at least those 2 fronts.
Good point. Good point.
And
okay.
I also want to add something that is to Santiago's comments here. I had a conversation with a potential client regarding a company in a medical field, and his comments was that I would like to hire lawyers because I don't want to deal with the legal paperwork and analysis in the background. I don't have time for this. So we're taking off the weight from the company's shoulders by overlooking all the contracts, negotiating contracts, providing NDAs, and also as well advising the client, see, we saw this, and this is of concern for us, and also drafting contracts for them as well. So that's exactly where we're coming from in terms of perspective of international law, where we can advise the client based on the legislation, the laws of the country, and also draft a legal memorandum where we need to actually advise when how to make a country more investor friendly. So we're taking that weight of problems off the shoulder of the company instead of dealing with boring legal contracts, legal technical jargon. They should be dealing most of the time about their business outlook and develop their business abroad than dealing with all the technical jargon and the issues that can bring on their business down. So that's why we always advise to hire a law firm when actually they deal with international transactions.
Sure. Well, it's one thing to know kind of what you should be doing, or it's another thing to know how to actually get that done, right? So the blocking and tackling of it. So very good. Thanks for sharing. Well, guys, I really appreciate you coming today. This was amazing. I think it was great information, not only for me. I think the listeners are going to benefit from it as well. But today we had two attorneys on the call, international business attorneys. We had Davey Carcason and Santiago Cueto from the Cueto Law Group. I appreciate you guys being here. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having us, Matt. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Absolutely. And all the links to all the contact information and the listeners today, when you find this podcast online, everything will be below it, their direct contact information for their firm. So you'll be super easy to find. And once again, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. So once again, for today, this was another episode of the Tax Alpha Podcast. This is Matt Chancey signing off. Until next time, take care.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Tax Alpha Solutions, brought to you by Matt Chancey. We hope you enjoyed listening to this week's guests and insight. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts.